Hello and welcome to the Scatterville channel, and today I want to show you guys how to build a streaming and gaming PC from start to finish. So this video here is going to be covering a single PC setup and more or less what are the most optimal parts you can choose for a streaming PC like this, because I mean technically you can stream on any device that you want, like even a basic $500 AMD laptop. You can stream with a PC like that obviously, but you may not get the results that you want. So I'm going to be covering the recommended PC parts for the most optimal streaming performance depending on your needs, and then I'll get into how to actually build a streaming PC with a cool little mini montage, which even if you have different PC parts than what I show right here, you can still follow the build process and the steps and more or less get to the same end result. And then I'll be tying off the whole video with what you should do with a PC like this once you're done building it, and talk about what things you should install, like drivers, any motherboard utilities, and then of course, OBS and Streamlabs. But like I said at the start of the video, you don't have to build a super flashy PC like the one that I have here behind me. You can build something for way less, like $500, and still get excellent streaming results. It's just this is the PC I'm gonna have here behind me for today's video. Though I am coming out with a future $500 budget gaming PC build guide that will be able to stream, and that will be releasing next week. So if you want to see how well a budget PC performs with streaming for $500, you may want to hit subscribe and stay tuned for that video. So with all that said, I want to give a thank you to Darkflash for actually sending over their DLV22 vertical PC case, which is why the motherboard is in a different layout than what you've seen traditionally, as well as some RGB fans and their double 120mm AIO liquid cooler. So with all that said, here's a quick word from our sponsor. Now, you may be curious, well, this is a brand new PC, and you guessed it, this has an unactivated version of Windows 10, specifically Windows 10 Pro, and you can see it right here. Activate Windows 10 Pro. Yeah, how do we fix this? So what I've done is I went ahead to VIPSCTkey.com, looked up a Windows 10 Pro key, went ahead and added one to my cart, applied my discount code, which is VIP Scatter, got a percentage off my order, checked out, got the key, placed it inside the Activate Windows 10 bar on this PC, and well, bam, this PC is all ready to go with an activated version of Windows 10 Pro for a really inexpensive price. So if you want to get your own inexpensive Windows 10 key, I'll have a link to VIPSCTkey.com as well as my discount code in the description below. So what are the best, or I guess recommended parts for a streaming and gaming PC like this? Well, like I said at the start of the video, you can literally stream on any PC. It's just the quality of the stream and how well your performance is going to come down, of course, still in the end to the hardware that you've chosen, and some CPUs and GPUs will perform better than the other for streaming depending on what sort of stream encoding you're going to be doing. So for all of you newbies who are like, wait, what's stream encoding? Well, you're going to need a way to broadcast your stream to like Twitch or YouTube gaming, and to do that, you're going to need to perform that through either CPU-based encoding, so the X264 encoder, or GPU-based encoding, like the NVEC encoder. So you're gonna have to decide with your streaming and gaming PC if you wanna be doing CPU-based encoding or GPU-based encoding, because that will affect your overall part selection for what sort of streaming and gaming PC that you ultimately want. But to kind of narrow down if you wanna do either of those routes, I think it more or less comes down to budget. So right here is a pros and cons list for going with either an X264 based encoding PC, so a CPU based encoding PC, or the NVEC encoder with a GPU based encoding PC. And as you can see, NVEC will generally yield better streaming results, but I only found that applied to their higher end series of graphics cards like the RTX 2060 and above. So I think really if you're working with a budget gaming PC where I think the priority should lie in gaming performance first, I think it's totally fine to go with a CPU-based encoder like X264 if you pair it up with a budget multi-core Ryzen processor like the Ryzen 3600, 1600AF, 2600, 3600 XT, 3100, 3300X, so on and so forth. But if you've got a lot of money to spend and you're willing to invest in a GPU like the RTX 2070 Super or above, then that's where I think you should stick to a GPU-based encoding PC. Now, with all this streaming encoding talk, there is sort of a third streaming encoding option, which is to go with an AMD Radeon graphics card with the AMF encoder, which is a GPU-based encoder, kind of similar to NVENC, but I don't recommend it because its streaming quality performance is not as good as NVENC and not even as good as X264. So with those two options just right there, especially if you have a budget multi-core Ryzen processor, I think trying to stream off of a Radeon RX graphics card right now in 2020 is not that viable, but it maybe will be soon in the future if AMD decides to get on the ball and improve that AMF encoder. All right, so if you've made your choice between a CPU-based and GPU-based encoding PC for your streaming solution, now let's decide on what processor you should go with. So 7 out of 10 times, I want to recommend Ryzen processors because those for the most part not only have excellent gaming performance, but offer more cores for the money and are generally better workhorse CPUs, not only for streaming, but even more so for editing. Say if you wanted to grab like your streaming highlights from your Twitch stream, bring them to Adobe Premiere or Sony Vegas, and create a post streaming highlights video that you want to crunch through and immediately post onto your YouTube channel. That will be all done faster for the most part on a Ryzen processor versus an Intel processor. Or you could be in a boat like me where I have my own personal gaming PC that I do sometimes stream on that uses an Intel processor, and for the most part, I'm not concerned with producing like a post-streaming highlights video. I don't really usually edit that sort of stuff, so I just want pure frames per second because I'm working with an RTX 2080 Super graphics card that I'm using the NVENC encoder on for that. So that does all the stream encoding, so I don't really need like a Ryzen CPU to encode my streams. I just need something that's just straight up fast, which I think a high-end Intel K-series CPU can do. But again, like I said, like 7 out of 10 times, you're gonna want to usually stick it to Ryzen processors for a streaming and gaming PC since they're so versatile. Now for the motherboard, it can be whatever you want. Choosing a certain motherboard isn't going to make your PC any better for like streaming or gaming. I would just recommend if you're going to use like a high-end Intel or Ryzen processor that you pair that up with a high-end chipset motherboard. Like for Ryzen, if you're going to choose an 8-core or above chip, I would go ahead and choose an X570 motherboard, or if you're going to be using like an 8-core or 10-core K-series Intel CPU, definitely go with a Z490 motherboard. But if you're going with anything below that, I think you're fine with going with like a budget B450 motherboard for AMD or B550, and for Intel, B460. Now for RAM, definitely make sure you have at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. 8 is not going to cut it. It already doesn't cut it for gaming, and if you add streaming on top of that, you're going to be not in for a good time. So I think 16 gigabytes will be suffice. You could go with 32 gigs like what I have behind here, but really that's only going to help out your streaming just a little bit more. And I find those gains are actually mostly noticed in editing. If you're editing something really crazy with a lot of intense visuals, which I don't think is going to be really of a concern for like a post-stream highlights video, that's just going to be cuts on a gameplay clip. So going with 32 gigabytes is, I think, a little bit overkill for a streaming and gaming PC, but the option is there. But more or less, make sure you at least have 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now for the speed, you can find that out on the CPU spec sheet of the CPU that you're interested in. Like say for a Ryzen processor, you're probably going to want to go with 3600 megahertz RAM, or if you're going with an Intel K-series CPU, 3200 megahertz should do the trick. Now for the graphics card, again, if you made your choice at the start of this video, if you're going to go with a CPU-based encoding PC or a GPU-based encoding PC, you'll already know what sort of graphics card you want. If you're going with a GPU-based encoding PC and you're willing to drop some dollars on a high-end NVIDIA graphics card, picking up an RTX 2060 or above will do great with that NVENC encoder. But if you're working with like a budget gaming PC and you want a value-oriented graphics card that can get you those frames per second that will help your gaming experience, which will be projected to your Twitch or YouTube viewers, then getting like either a budget Radeon or NVIDIA graphics card will also do the trick. That can either be like an RX 5500 XT or a GTX 1650 Super, because all the encoding for that sort of solution, of course, you're planning to do on like a multi-core Ryzen processor. But those notes aside, still, whatever graphics card you choose in the end for your gaming and streaming PC will affect, of course, how fast you render and project games to your monitor. So if you want something that's really fast to take advantage of, say, like a 144 Hz capable gaming monitor, then invest in a semi-high-end graphics card. But if you don't care about that and you just want a great budget solution, again, you don't have to spend as much for a graphics card. Now for storage, you got quite a bit of options here. If it were me and I were building like a streaming and gaming PC, I would go ahead and have a primary storage drive for like my operating system and primary programs on like a 256 gigabyte to 512 gigabyte SSD. It can be M.2 or SATA, and then offload all of my games and video files from my streams onto a large capacity hard drive that's either 1 or 2 terabytes in storage. I think that would be the most optimal, because then you have like a really fast drive that you can boot up to with your Windows on every single day, but then have a hard drive you can just tax on every single day to actually play your games, render out your video files or stream highlights or whatever too, and have that be a really efficient storage solution. Or if you're willing to drop some really big dollars, you can just get a really huge like 2 terabyte M.2 SSD and just have everything on it. But of course that's going to be the most expensive, but it will have everything on a single drive with, I think, plenty of storage, and it'll be really fast at the same time. And now for the CPU cooler, case, and power supply, ultimately that stuff is all up to you. Now for the power supply, of course, I'd recommend Googling like a power supply calculator, seeing how much your system is going to be using, which can be anywhere from like 500 watts to 700 watts, depending on what sort of hardware you throw into a PC, but it shouldn't be that hard to figure out. And of course, for the PC case, if you have like a micro ATX sized motherboard, just make sure your PC case is either micro ATX or bigger. And same thing goes for ATX. Make sure you have an ATX case or bigger if you're going with an ATX sized motherboard. And then for the CPU cooler, like, choose whatever you like. The stock cooler is quite fine as is, but for me, I'm going with that flashy Darkflash cooler that is going to keep our CPU cool and quiet. Now we've made it to how I actually built this PC here behind me, and I will note that this won't be a full-blown tutorial for how to actually build this exact streaming PC, because I suspect a lot of you who may be looking at this guide are probably going to be customizing your own sort of streaming PC with a different case or a different motherboard, different whatever. But regardless, the actual building steps and the process should be nearly the same, which I will be demonstrating throughout this section. If you are looking for an in-depth tutorial, I do have a video linked in the description below showing you how to build a PC, for the most part more in-depth. But again, those may use different parts, but trust me, that won't change the build process at all. For those specifics that you may be wondering, like, wait, if I go with this motherboard, it's going to be different in this way. You can solve that with the manual that comes with that motherboard, because those are what manuals are for. So with that said, here is the building montage of the PC. So now that you finished building your PC, now let's talk about what to do with it now, because you should see like a Windows and be like, oh, now it's time to install Windows 10, which is actually really easy to do from this point on forth. So you go ahead, choose custom installation. You don't have to have a Windows 10 key on you right away, and you can choose the drive you're going to be installing to, which in this case is going to be the SSD for at least this PC, and just let that run through. And then once it gets through installing and it asks you like different permissions for what you want to enable and disable, I'm just going to disable them all because I don't need them, and those are just extra processes in the background taking up more RAM. So I'm going to disable all of those, and now I should be at a clean slate Windows 10 home that is unactivated, which again you can activate through like a cheap, inexpensive Windows 10 key site like VIP SED key. So the first thing I like to do is install GPU drivers. So of course, depending on what graphics card you choose, type in Radeon or NVIDIA graphics card drivers. Go ahead and click on the first link that's not like suspicious. So it should be like nvidia.com or Radeon or AMD.com. Go ahead and look up the graphics card you put into your PC. Go ahead and click search, find the driver, click it, wait for it to download, then start installing it. I recommend doing like express installation, don't thread about it, and you should be pretty much good to go after that. And then after that, I like to install motherboard drivers and any sort of motherboard utilities. So to do that, go ahead and Google your motherboard along with utilities or drivers. Click on the first link that looks good, go to BIOS and drivers or like utilities, and go ahead and scroll down to either B450 chipset drivers, B550 chipset drivers, B460 chipset drivers, depending on whatever motherboard you have. You just want to go to the link that says chipset drivers, go ahead and start installing those. And then after that, you've more or less completed the necessary things I want you to install for a streaming and gaming PC, but you have the option to install other motherboard utilities like any sort of RGB software or stuff like that, which aren't essential, but can really spruce up a PC like this behind me. So once you've taken care of your graphics card drivers and your motherboard drivers and any miscellaneous motherboard utilities, the last thing you got to install is OBS or Streamlabs. I don't have any experience with XSplit, so I'm not going to be using it for this tutorial, but if you do, you can totally use that as well. Now again, remember if your PC is going to be a CPU-based encoding PC or GPU-based encoding PC, because that'll depend once you go to the output screen in your OBS Streamlabs settings and you choose if you want to use either the X264 or NVENC encoder. So for this PC, I have an RTX 2060 Super, and I'm going to be using the NVENC encoder on that. So I'm going to go ahead and go down to the NVENC encoder tab, select that, and I'm going to go ahead and set the quality to quality for the streaming preset. So right here is a chart on screen for the different processors and NVIDIA graphics cards I recommend setting these different streaming presets to. Of course, the more you spend on a higher end CPU or GPU will result you in having a better streaming preset for more streaming quality. But of course, I mean, it comes down to your budget and how much you're willing to spend. So that should be it for basically building your streaming and gaming PC. You can get right away to basically streaming and gaming, like what the title of this video says. Now I won't go in depth for how to like completely set up OBS and Streamlabs. There are videos on YouTube showing you exactly how to do that. I just wanted to show you guys the hardware end and show you how to set all that up, as well as how to choose the most optimal PC parts. And again, you don't have to spend tons of money on a streaming PC like this. You can build something for $500, which we'll be releasing next week on my YouTube channel, which if you want to see that, definitely subscribe. That PC will be able to stream and game at the same time. And we'll kind of show you that you don't have to build a PC of this level to get really nice streaming results. So with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and this is the Scatterable channel, signing out.